Yeah, this is the 11th. So by mistake, I wrote 9th in my PowerPoint. The 11th symposium of this Halcyon Days in Crete series. Most of you perhaps know that this is an established series of symposia inaugurated by the late Elizabeth Zachariadou in 1991. So we have one every 3 years, and this was going to take place last January, but due to the pandemic, we postponed it in the hope that we could have it with physical presence, which alas was not possible, so we have it as you see it now. You can see the volumes of the proceedings which are published by Crete University Press following a double-blind peer review, and we hope that this symposium will also produce a magnificent volume. I'm very happy that all of you did make it until here. So our topic this year is Enchantments and Disenchantments, Early Modern Ottoman Visions of the World, which is makes it a symposium in the context of our research project named GHOST, which means Geography and History of the Ottoman Supernatural Tradition, a 5-year project which is going to take an extension of 1 year due to the pandemic, funded by the European Research Council. So you can all visit our site, follow the project on Facebook or Twitter, and of course, there is our open access journal, Ajaib, whose first issue was it's open access, and its first issue was published last year, 2020, and the current issue is going to be launched in a very few days. We're just waiting for the DOI numbers to be issued, and it will be public in for sure next week. So this is what I had to say. I welcome you all, and I give the floor to our director, Jill Mechanolaftis, and welcome you again on board.
Hello from me as well to everybody. Happy New Year. Καλή χρονιά, χρόνια μας πολλά. Welcome to our virtual IMS. As Marino said, we would have been more than happy to have you with us and enjoy seeing each other. Hopefully we'll be able to do this soon in one way or another with some of you, and certainly in the next Halcyon Days. Yes, this is the 11th International Symposium, and as you know, here in Rethymno, Ottoman studies are triumphant, as Michael Ursinus was so kind to write. The Department of Ottoman History of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies of the Foundation of Research and Technology is the only research unit in Greece that carries out research in Ottoman history. And we're very proud of the work that has been done, and it is currently taking place with not one, but 2 ERC grants and more research projects that take place along with the educational activities of our researchers and collaborating professors. The Halcyon Days having, as Marinos said as well, been carried out systematically 30 years now, are part of our success story. And I'm very happy to participate in this one. I wish you all a prolific and fulfilling conference. And I suppose, Marino, that I can now, change my position and become the chair of the first session, right? Good. So we're happy to start with 3 speakers, and we will have first Zeynep Aydogan, and then Renaud Soler, and then Nicolas Pieces. So we start from Zeynep, whom we are very happy to have with us here in Rethymno and enjoy her company as well. apart from her diligence. She's always found in her office whenever I enter the room. So Zeynep has graduated from Bogazici University, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, and she's taken part in the research center of Koç University as and also as a postdoc fellow in Berlin Graduate School, in Freie Universität Berlin, and also in the Central Asian Studies, the Humboldt University. And this is where you got your PhD, Zeynep? Yes, yeah. So here we are, and she's going to talk to us about antinomian dervishes and anti-keramet polemics before the age of confessionalization. So we're with you, Zeynep.
Thank you very much, Jelina, for this kind introduction. I will try to keep up to this very generous, introduction. So today, what I'm going to present is a piece of my ongoing research within the GHOST project. I'm working on the supernatural elements in a corpus of Turkish hagiographies, Enachronisms or Vilayetnames as they are called. These are essentially collections of anecdotes focusing on the miraculous deeds of their main protagonist. So I will start with an anecdote reported by Eflaki about a man who made a snide remark about Rumi's attending a chant session, a music session. Rumi turned his critic deaf and blind with a single gaze and humbly explained that this was an act of divine grace, whereas for some, it could be seen as a miraculous deed. When further challenged with the argument that one should not believe in the acts that intellect cannot grasp, Rumi strikes the right note, and he says, quite the contrary, a miracle is one that incapacitates the intellect from grasping. So the word mucize, miracle, coming from the Arabic roots, adds literally an act that incapacitates, became synonymous with a prophetic miracle since it incapacitates another from repeating or imitating. And as can be seen from this example, different interpretations also emerged in time and polemics therefrom. As distinct from a prophetic miracle, the word that is more generally used for such wondrous deeds is keramet, favor or gifts bestowed by God to the evliya or friends or saints of God. The concept of velayet, having flourished within the Sufi circles of the Islamic world starting from the 9th century, appears in its most sophisticated form in the writings of Ibn Arabi. And some Muslim theologians, however, disapproved the performance of divine miracles, these keramets, by the Sufis, since these might be confused with the prophetic miracles. Some even argued that these were demonic deceptions and condemned those who believed in them as ignorant. Often, it was not the authenticity of these deeds, but rather their incorporation into Islamic prescriptions, which was a point of debate. So the hagiographies, which I am working on, constantly articulate questions or doubts around the true nature of the protagonist's saintly character. He is often mistaken for being a jaddu, a sorcerer. And given the multitude of his miraculous deeds, this conviction maybe does not seem very surprising. Is it a prophet capable of performing miracles, a false prophet, a charlatan deceiving people? Is he a magician, sahir, casting spell upon people, a friend of God, a veli, or in the same vein, he can also be taken as a deli, a madman? What sets the limit between these labels? So this question was basically the departure point for my research. Of course, the study of velayet concept and in extension, the whole menakıb-name genre offers many challenges, not only because of the nature of the genre, but also the period aftermath of the Mongol invasions of the 13th century is marked by the destruction of political and religious institutions across many centers in the Islamic lands. And this led to the formation of new forms of religiosity that developed its own institutions and networks of Islamic mysticism, which all have to be understood on their own terms. In Anatolia, fluidity and untidiness, I quote, characterized as the main features of Sufism by some scholars, prevailed over the course of the next 300 years or so, until the establishment of the regional empires of the Ottomans, Safavids, Uzbeks, and Mughals, under which some of the Sufi paths became institutionalized, as you might already know, under strict governmental scrutiny, and were finally incorporated into organized tariqas. But until then, the political turmoil and chaotic cultural setting in Anatolia and the Balkans, creating room for the proliferation of saintly figures who could combine their military and proselytizing endeavors in their charisma, giving rise to a different kind of religious expression, which also found an outlet in Sufism. So this anarchic period, as it is called sometimes, also gave way to messianic expectations, where Muslim holy men and also rulers competed to become divine saviors, and in this way tried to respond to the needs or concerns of the local populations by facing daily perils and uncertainties of the time. This new renunciation, a term coined by Ahmet Kaya Mustafa in this anarchic thrust, came as a reaction to the institutionalized Sufis, according to him. And the new renunciatory dervish piety upheld more radical forms of poverty with an open rejection of social and religious norms. The antinomian dervishes wandered around with their shocking physical appearance, raised facial hair, and almost naked, as in the case of the Abdals of Rum. And some or almost all of them rejected the form of performed the Islamic ritual practices. And if these renunciatory acts were ways to come closer to the divine, showing keramets were definitely a proof of that proximity. From a general point of view, keramets function to ease the pain of existence, as I will call it, as most of them are concerned with trying to establish some control over the nature, over the future. And so the Evliya were seen basically as direct pathways to God who could find remedy for the mundane problems by healing diseases, multiplying food, treating fertility, creating source of water, or even reassigning gender in some cases. Another important function of these miraculous deeds has to do with the ongoing Islamization process in Anatolia and the Balkans, of course, which was achieved or given impetus as some of the miraculous deeds attributed to Muslim holy men gradually replace those around the vita of the local Christian saints. As previous studies have shown, many of these sacred sites associated with the Christian saints were taken over by these mystic figures who also converted these sites into Muslim sanctuaries. And some of the keramets recorded in the hagiographies, especially those coming from a biblical origin, such as walking on water or resurrection of the dead, must have been used as an effective tool for converting Christians, but also these examples can and should be approached as part of the religious polemics that crystallize around the question of superiority of one religion over the other. As Tiana Kristich accurately notes, replicating the miracles attributed to Jesus is in fact, I quote, an argument against Jesus' uniqueness and the Christians' claim that he is the Son of God and God himself. Therefore, I don't think it's a coincidence that the accusations of the Muslim holy man as being sorcerers are voiced especially by the Christians. In a number of examples, Sarı Saltuk desperately tries to explain that it's not magic, but velayet, the miracle of our prophet. Bizim peygamberimizin mucizesidir. he says, note the emphasis on the Prophet of Islam and his intermediary force enabling Sarsal to perform miracles. This is also what distinguishes the Evliya from Jadis or Sahirs. It should be also noted that such demonstration of skills was actually demanded of these dervishes, where their occult powers were put to test on a regular basis, probably when, for example, Barak Baba, a disciple of Sarı Saltuk, came to the presence of Gazanhan in Tabriz. He is said to have controlled a tiger or a lion, according to some accounts, with a single cry. In Damascus, he was asked to confront a wild ostrich, which he is reported to have tamed instantly. So the excessive demand for such performances sometimes tested the patience of the Evliya rather than their supernatural skills, I think. When Sayyid Harun is asked to respond to a keramet of Dedi Sultan, who bestrode a bear, he verily expresses his aspiration towards people who cannot get enough. Keramet görmeye doymadınız. Okay, I'm not going to go into the meaning of this whole domesticating the animal, taming the soul theme in Islamic mysticism. Just I'd like to focus more on social reactions, the reactions of the people witnessing such phenomena and what the sources disclosed about what was believable and what was not. To answer this question, while the positive reactions range from being struck by oddity, admiration, bewilderment, being frightened to the degree of losing consciousness is also quite often reported. The physical appearance of the antinomian dervishes was perhaps the major cause that must have aroused both amusement and disgust among the general public. Let us take the example of Barak Baba again, who was extremely filthy, going around naked except for a loincloth and a turban to which cow horns were attached. He was reported to dance like a bear, sing like a monkey in the company of his disciples playing drums and tambourines. Ottoman Baba is also described as having a similar appearance. I quote from his Vilayetname, extremely wretched and deprived of any sign of sainthood. And this is further explained by a hadith which says, I will skip the Arabic, original is in the Vilayetname also quoted. The Evliya are under my dome, nobody knows who they are but me. So Ottoman Baba is often taken as a madman, deli or kaçkun. Kaçkun literally means fugitive, but I think it's most in this context is used specifically for the social subversive. And at times he's even exposed to cruel treatment by being mopped around with a cord wrapped around his neck. And similarly, Hajim Sultan is ridiculed by the Turkomans of the Germian region as a madman, even after he showed signs of keramet. I quote, some believed him, some did not. This person is mad, should not be trusted, they said. Bir nicesi inandı, bir nicesi inanmadı. Adam sende. Bu bir divanedir. Ne itibar dediler. So when Hajim Sultan, the same Hajim Sultan, arrives in Susuz, where he's supposed to settle down upon the instructions of the Prophet of Islam, who appeared in a dream, he is threatened for his life by the nomadic pastoralists, again, who want him to leave the area. Of course, such acts do not remain unreciprocated. The wrath of a saint is definitely something to be avoided, as a terrible disease soon befell that tribe, killing almost all its members. The work of a saint is not restricted to the spiritual domain and is not as simple as creating water resources by a single blow to the ground. In this period of community building, if one might refer to it as such, the Muslim holy men had to take action literally into their own hands and actually build things for the community. Their biographies portray them as founders of cities, such as the case with Hajim Sultan and Sayyid Harun, whom I mentioned above. Obviously, there are more examples of these active colonization efforts, which is also demonstrated by Ömer Lütfi Barkan in his classic study. But one example from the Vilayetname Otman Baba, again, depicts him wandering around in wilderness, offering villagers his services for free, ücretsiz hizmet ederdi, by working the land, carrying water, shoveling up their barn. He even builds a bridge with his own hands instead of using his supernatural powers to help people cross rivers, apparently a topic that required frequent help. And the locals also come to help him, and the bridge is completed by their joint effort, which at first glance does not seem to comply also either with the image of these dervishes being socially subversive. However, these anecdotes can also be explained by the fact that Otman Baba openly rejected the acceptance of alms, whereas he and his abdals lived on the sacrificial animals which they collected, probably in return for their services. A last point I would like to raise is about the complicated relationship of some of these figures with the ruling political and religious elite. Some keramets, such as, for instance, claiming to have undergone metempsychosis, tenasüh, which is completely against Sunnite Islamic doctrine. These could bring them into trouble with state authorities, but not to their bitter end, at least not yet in this period where these sources are recorded. Otman Baba claims repeatedly that he is the incarnation of the prophets Muhammad, Jesus, Moses, and Adam, aside from several other saintly figures such as Hacı Bektaş and Sarı Saltuk. Moreover, he also asserts his unity with God through Enel Hak. In a question and answer format, his Vilayetname brings clarity to this question, assuming that there was an audience seeking an explanation. So I will quote, "If they ask, the phrase Enel Hak is a blasphemy, Enel Hak, I am God, is a blasphemy, why did the Khan Velayet, Otman Baba, utter such a phrase? The answer is as follows. Neither on earth or in the heavens, he, Otman Baba, does not see anything else but God. United with God, he becomes God. There is nothing else but God, which is transfigured in his heart. Even if they try to kill him, in no way they can. One saintly figure once said," I skipped the Arabic phrase, "that is to say, God is under my kaftan. The kaftan is not the one worn as ornament in this world. That kaftan is the one upon which befalls the look of God the greatest, 70 times a day, with all his magnificence." Another holy man once said, in Arabic, "that is, the son of two worlds is inside my existence. With the divine name of God's unity, Vahdaniyet, oneness becomes manifest. Whoever intends to kill those whose heart and soul is with God, in fact, attempt on their own life." So while the subtle warning directed towards those who might want to attempt on Otman Baba's life is worthy of notice, this example reveals another important line of criticism, one that is raised towards the urbanite elite, I believe, composed of religious scholars as well as mainstream Sufis, represented here through the symbol of their attire, their kaftan. Otman Baba accuses some of the evliya for deceiving people with their learned sciences. He expresses his disgust through several outbursts like "Bak bre çirkin gebe karınlı şehirlisi," and it's very difficult to translate, and hitting their turban to the ground whenever he encountered one was apparently also a routinized practice for him, because I encountered the same exact phrase 6 times in the text. "Şehirliye bir kötek vururdu kim başından dülmende düşüp hacil olurdu." So there is a last striking example I would like to share with you from the Vilayetname Hacı Bektaş, where during his confrontation with the Molla Saadettin, Hacı Bektaş puts his hand down to Molla's throat, squeezes his heart until 3 drops of blood come out. So this is the keramet. And this three drops of blood is important because later on they will provide the hard evidence. Needless to say, Molla passes out upon this horrific experience. When he tells the schoolmen, danishmens in his circle what happened, their reaction, I think, is worthy of note. They ask him why he didn't confront him using his knowledge of sciences. Ona dürlü sual soraydın, ilim yüzünden arayaydın. And after 18 years of devotion to Hacı Bektaş, Molla Saadettin, again, decides to kill Hacı Bektaş one day, believing that he had wasted all his knowledge and skills in exchange for being a mere servant. Bunca ilmim ve bunca hünerim vardı, beni kendine kul eyledi. So Hacı Bektaş's own explanation for this betrayal is also interesting. He says that the black stain of the ink in Molla's teeth, which Hacı Bektaş failed to clean, even after having rubbed 70 times with blessed water. So the black stain of the ink. Dişlerinden mürekkep karasını silemedim. So to conclude, although I don't have a conclusion, I would like to finish by saying that these examples clearly corroborate the formation of a specific form of dervish piety termed as a vernacular form of Islam by Ahmet Kara Mustafa, which according to him developed in dialectical interaction with urban mainstream Sufism and in opposition to medrese-trained religious scholars and the Sharia-based practices. I believe by extending my research to include the hagiographies written into urbanized Sufi circles and also those dating back from later periods after the heroic age comes to an end, to use Gottfried Hagen's phrase, I will be able to arrive at better conclusions when I have a chance to compare and trace the changes in the repertoire of Kerames and make better sense of their ideological implications. Thank you very much. I will really appreciate any comments and feedbacks that can help further my research at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zeynep, also for keeping your time. Marino, you are the archivos. We keep 10 minutes of questions for each paper. Right. I do have a question from Maria Mavroudi for Zeynep. So it is, Maria says, some of the figures discussed remind the Byzantinist of the tradition of holy fools, attested at least since late antiquity, and had a significant career as a type of saint in Slavic lands. Given that some of the ajaib can be taken as part of a religious polemic, can the development of this type of holy, one who does not look or behave like a saint, in Islam be part of the same polemics? Knowing the geography of the phenomenon would, of course, be significant, and I don't know it. So, Zeynep.
Well, I don't know how to respond to that. Yeah, I mean, my knowledge fails me to make such a big, I think, to make an argument about this. So.
But what can you, like, I mean, we're not committing this to writing. I just want your reactions, your thoughts.
Like if there are like an exchange of polemics in between those different types of saints, maybe I didn't.
This is really a familiar behavior. Like if you are a Christian, the idea of a holy fool, somebody who dresses like crazy, behaves like crazy, and with this type of craziness has a certain amount of freedom to speak, to kind of approach authority, etc., creates a space of authority for himself in this way, is a very familiar thing to Christians. And of course, depending on the geography, are we in Anatolia, are we in the Balkans, and even further, like I really don't know where these people are moving that you are seeing in your texts. I'm not an Ottomanist. But to a certain type of Christian audience, this type of person would have been very familiar. And then it becomes another thing of polemic, like the miracles of walking on water and the miracles of multiplying food, etc. All of these miracles that have a biblical precedent.
Yes. Also, I think this kind of this meczup or other types of even, crazies, but like saintly figures, they were they were all acknowledged in Sufism from early period onwards. So these type of people, they weren't asked to follow religious practices, and they didn't have to perform any Islamic rituals. So maybe this is coming from that, but also like after this dialogue, they were given even more, they could find even a more free space in Anatolia, and yeah. So,
and I'm wondering also, oh, sorry, if there are...
I am sorry, there is a great, I'm sorry for this to interrupt, there's a great queue of questions lying down. We have 10 minutes, so, but please finish your question, Maria Mavroudi.
No, I mean, I was just thinking that other religions with which Islam came into contact may also provide a model. I was thinking Jainism in India, for example. But again, the geography of all this is very significant.
It is. Yeah, thank you. This is a great topic for me to think more and make more comparisons. And yeah, thank you.
So I will use Dimitris Yadzoglu, and then I will go with the raised hands. Says Zeynep, bravo, great presentation. Could you please elaborate a bit on the topic of Sufis bringing people back from the dead?
Yeah, this keramet actually I encountered in the Vilayetname of Hacı Bektaş. Whether with animals, it can be applied, and there are some it's not very common, but there are examples of this kind of resurrecting from the dead. And some I think sources, they had to censor that type of keramet, because it is in these there are always the intermediary of the Prophet of Islam, or it says always God order. Upon the God orders, this happened, and the mujizat, the miracle of the Prophet of Islam, this happened. So there is always this explanation. And some sources, I was saying, they say that, for example, in the Saltukname exists, I remember, Sarı Saltuk tries to resurrect someone from the dead, but this person wasn't dead. So there is also this kind of, not trying to really compete, just in case that kind of, miraculous deed. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's an answer.
I think it's Marino's time now.
Just a comment, very short about the question of Maria Mavroudi, that if I remember well, in his book about the madman, Michael Dawes talks about the phenomenon of the type of saint fool in medieval Islam as well. So there is a wider tradition than just Byzantine, perhaps. Mm-hmm. A comment rather than a question.
Okay, thank you, Marinos. You want to say something, Zeynep?
No.
Okay, it's the turn of Harun Küçük.
Hi, wonderful presentation. As I was listening to you, I couldn't help myself but notice all the numbers that come up in this story. What do you make of them? Do you think they're just like random numbers, or is there a certain arithmetic of sanctity, so to speak? What would you say, since, because of the nature of the sources that you work with on a regular basis, you probably encountered these numbers a lot. What do you do with them?
I mean, I have to really get more into this, because these numbers mean, obviously they mean things like, or even the number 40, this abdal substituting the others. And for some, Sufis, the numbers might change. Apparently this number 70 means something, but I'm not very knowledgeable at this stage, but I will definitely look into it more. Yeah, they mean something.
Okay, thank you. It's Eleni Gara.
Thank you very much, Zeynep. I was wondering, these texts that you have been working on until now date all from the same, let's say, time slot. I mean, the text per se, not the stories they are about. And do you see, or I mean, if you had the opportunity to see any change in the tradition of the textual transmission of these miracles between, let's say, earlier and later times, in case, of course, there are differences in the various manuscripts? Thank you.
Thank you. This is also a very long question to answer, but for the ones that I mentioned, some of these hagiographies that I mentioned, they are mostly written in the second half of the 15th century, but based on the oral material that was already, circulating, with the exception that Ottoman Baba died briefly, like soon before his Vilayetname was written. And of course, my future endeavor would be, comparing these texts with the ones that are composed in a later period, because this changed a lot. Even, each text had to be analyzed in its own terms. It maybe for me it was a bit confusing to just throw examples from one to the other. But I just wanted to share what I could make of this social reactions. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Godfried Hagen.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating material, but I'm wondering how in this work with these hagiographies you're handling the fact that this as a genre they're actually quite variegated. I mean, you have the text like the Ottoman Baba Vilayetname on one hand, and then especially this puzzling monster of the Saltukname, right? Which after all is first of all a hodgepodge of different local traditions, and then assembled and transported into a courtly milieu where it has actually to confront different types of discourses. So how do you actually separate out the layers of what is happening with the saint or what is sort of remembered locally and what is then re-narrated in a different milieu where it undergoes sort of, for instance, different processes of fictionalization and has to engage the more orthodox conceptualizations of sainthood. Is there a strategy there?
I mean, I've been a bit lucky because I dedicated almost more than 10 years studying Saltukname, because this was basically the main text I studied during my PhD. So to use a phrase of Professor Kafadar, I try to read the meaning in layer. But in order to do that, you have to, of course, identify the layer and on which you can base your historical analysis. So yeah, I should be extremely careful identifying which material could come from which circle, and some layers they are having anachronistic, references from the 16th century should be dealt extremely carefully when dealing with the Saltukname, at least. And also is equally important, all these micro developments in a locality where his local saint was, or the stories about him had been circulating. So,
I mean, can I ask? Do you think that the a text like the Salterkname simply represents the same claim to factional truth as the Ottoman Baba Vilayetnamesi?
I mean, and also I cannot say that, and it's not the truth, but like the way we can make sense of some examples, and most of the examples I was dealing with also, they could be read from different perspectives, and you could make sense of them in a very different ways, depending from where you are approaching this particular, incident there. So even like these are many layered texts, but the examples are also many layered. So they are extremely difficult texts to deal with, but I don't know. I'm a masochist, I believe. That kind of endeavor also, I like it because it's like, it gives you room to, experiment, let's say. But I have to be careful, of course.
We all have to be careful with what we read and interpret, Zeynep. This is so good. The last question by Slobodan Ilic.
Hello, Zeynep. I liked very much your paper. I have a short question concerning the Ottoman Baba Vilayetnamesi. Have you used published Vilayetname, or you consulted manuscript also?
I mean, I didn't consult the manuscript. There is a new edition by Crete, and I believe there are several.
There is an introductory part of Vilayetname in Ankara manuscript, which is omitted in all publications.
Really?
And it deals exactly with this stratification or subordination of valleys expressed in numbers, yüzler, kırklar, yediler, dörtler, etc. And I would strongly advise to look in it if you already have it. And regarding regarding this mujize and keramet with bringing people back to life who already died, I think this is not only showing a very strong Christian influence, but also very much in contrast with Islamic creed. I mean, this is exactly one of things which Muslims reproach Christians, saying that not even prophet of Islam can do this. And it is something what was exclusively attached to Jesus, even used in some hadiths. Probably many of you know the famous saying of which was Jesus said, and it was transmitted through Ali, I think, saying, ما عجزت عن إحياء الموتى ولكن عجزت عن معالجة أحمق واحد. I was able even to bring dead people to life, but they cannot put a bit of reason in the head of a fool in all my life. It is very common used, and unfortunately very much remembered in last years. So we are talking, I assume, all the time about Anatolia and pre-Ottoman Anatolia. So I think that many of these antinomian dervishes practices, they are brought together with the Turkmens from Maveraun Nehr, so brought from Central Asia, and not having direct influence of local Christians or whatever. But this story about the bringing people back to life is very much Lazarus' story and very much connected with Christians of Anatolia. This is at least my opinion. And thank you again for very nice and inspiring presentation.
For your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Zeynep. Thank you all for listening and asking questions. We continue now with Renaud Soler, who has graduated from Université de Paris Sorbonne and where he also completed his thesis and where he now teaches, but he has also attended a number of schools in Turkey, in Egypt, and has been a visiting doctoral student as well in the Freie Universität Berlin. He is going to talk to us on La vie du prophète et l'ordre des choses. I'm not going to go on with the names next to this, so here we are with you, René Soler.
Hi, everybody. I will just share my screen. All right. Well, I'm going to speak in English in order to be understood from everybody. So let's start. I just want to see the time.
Why don't you put, you press F5 or up to...
All right, okay. Okay.
We're fine.
So, yeah, I would like to thank Marinus for his invitation and all the people who organized this symposium. I would like to start also to say a word about myself because, well, I'm very glad to be here or in connection with you and able to share my work with Ottomanists because I was trained as an Arabist and in Arabic studies. And in order to be able to deal with my PhD subject, which was the writing of the Sira in Arabic or Siyar in Turkish, I had to deal with texts in Ottoman Turkish and in Turkish, Ottoman Turkish and Persian. So what I'm going to say is also, like Zeynep, based upon researches I've been doing for the last few years. I would like to start with a word about the topic of the symposium, Enchantments and Disenchantments, Early Ottoman Vision of the World. Because people with a Western modern education have a tendency to conceive this problem in terms of natural and supernatural, I would like to say a word about this issue. Since the 17th century, the scientific and philosophical revolutions have tended to coin a new concept of nature, very different from what it was, for example, in the antiquity, Greece and Rome, or in the Middle Ages. What is interesting is the fact that in the Islamic world, and especially in the Ottoman Empire, nature retained most of its Greek and Aristotelian, especially, meanings. And you can see that in the slide, in the definition of the word tiba, in the traduction of the Qamus of Firuzabadi by Asm Effendi. In fact, this discussion about the meaning of nature, which is very contemporary in anthropology, has a very interesting precedent, namely a symposium held in Paris in 1978 around the notion of, or the notions of merveilleux, wonderful, and étrange, strange. I would take two ideas from this symposium. The first is that we have no equivalent of the modern concept of nature in medieval Christianity or in the Islamic Middle Ages. The first important idea is the fact that the supernatural has different, or does not encapsulate an homogeneous category of phenomenon. And the participants of this symposium had come to distinguish between two kinds of supernatural, what we call supernatural phenomenons. The first is the surnature as a term of Christian theology, which has no equivalent in Arabic or Turkish, except in Christian Arabic. So ma fawq at-tabi'a. And this surnature should be related to transcendence or different kind of acts of God from the Quran two different kinds of miracles or charisma. The second idea, or the second kind of supernatural phenomenon, are strange, wonderful things. And in this regard, Zakaria al-Qazwini, the writer, the author of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, is a very good guide because it was, as you know, translated and adapted in Turkish and in Ottoman Turkish. And in the introduction of his work, he gives a definition of wonderful and strange things. And it's related to the fact that we know, or that we can't know the cause of a phenomenon. It is ajab, or for the gharib, a rare thing which contradicts the customs, sunnat, ada of God. As a consequence, when we are interested with nature, supernatural phenomena, we have to deal with at least three fields in which the order of the world is described: theology, which gives definitions of miracles, for example, cosmology, and history. And in this period, the life of the prophet was considered as part of history. And it's very clear when you look at the classification of knowledge. I would like to give a graphic example of what I tried to distinguish conceptually. You have here a beautiful retable of Fabriano, which represents the adoration of the Magi. From the Christian perspective, of course, this event is an historical one, whose knowledge relies upon the Bible, the interpretations of the fathers of the church, and the authority of the church. But Fabriano was also a painter, and he must comply with certain artistic convention of his time. So when you look at the three Magi who became kings in the course of time, you remark that they are wearing sumptuous clothing, and that's a convention in late Gothic art, and that they represent the three ages of life: childhood, adulthood, and oldness. I would say that in this graphical representation of the adoration of the Magi,
it seems that he's cut off.
yeah. Oof. Was it cut?
Yeah, no, it's again screen sharing. Yeah.
Okay, a very bad connection. Sorry.
I am sorry, but you have to go a little bit faster because you're losing quite a lot of time with it.
Okay. The distinction between history and convention is sometimes tenuous and above all dependent on the culture of the spectator. Is to say dependent on sociology. But this distinction was real, and I shall now demonstrate it with the example of Nahifi. In fact, when we read an Ottoman historical or cosmological text, we face the same problem as the spectator of the retable of Fabriano. What's real, what's artificial, what's conventional? In order to solve this problem, we have only one solution, which is comparison between different versions of the same event. For this purpose, Nahifi is a very fit author because he wrote several mesnevi, long poems on the life of the prophet or different events of his life. And especially in his Mirajiyeh, the story of the ascension of the prophet, he makes a triple comparison between the hadith in Arabic, a plain translation in Turkish, and then a literary rewriting. I cannot go into details, but I can say that after the study of the different Mesnevis, that the main literary transformation by Nahifi are the following. In the literary writing, Nahifi adds angels everywhere, and it reminds of the techniques of religious painters in Christianity. He also adds or invents speeches or uses poetry as speeches of characters of the events. He avoids the repetitions in hadith. He describes important events with esoteric Sufi terms, and he used to describe paradise and other wonderful places like gardens of worldly pleasures, as you can see in the verses. That's to say, the literary conventions were a way of enchanting the world. But it doesn't mean that historical facts, at least for many Ottoman Muslims of the 17th century, were neglected. I will use another life of the Prophet to demonstrate this point. As you know, the life of the Prophet of Vaisi, who served many years as a judge in Üsküp, is famous as the first Siyer-i-Nebi written in Ottoman Turkish prosa. This work is renowned as a masterpiece of Ottoman Turkish artistic prosa. Yet this is only one side of the coin. Vaisi was a Sunni Orthodox, and this quality is as important as his quality as an artist. In fact, I have shown in my PhD that the 17th century is characterized by a very clear Sunnitization of the writing of the Sirah in many aspects. And it's quite visible in the Siyar of Vaisi. And this Siyar is very interesting because we have a quite interesting artistic elaboration, and it is at the same time use of the Sunni Orthodox version of many events of the life of the Prophet, like his Ascension. The Ascension of Vaisi adopts the basis of Arabic sources, some of which were translated in the 16th century, and changes the story of the Ascension when we compare it to older sources like the Mevlid of Suleiman Çelebi or the Siyer-i-Nebi from Mustafa Darir.
Aye. Again, I think it's a cut. But you're there and all, yeah?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Please again.
Okay.
Share the screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll give just two examples of this writing of the Sirah by Suleiman Çelebi, by Vaisi. The first is the Ascension of the Prophet. And we can see here the mix of the two dimensions of the literary writing or rewriting of the story and the Orthodox version of the Ascension for Sunni scholars. In the first extract on the slide, you have on the right side, the Ottoman version. And you see here the adoption of the Orthodox thesis, namely that the Ascension took place in body, cesedi etaları hem inanı ruh münevver olup, and awake, bidar iken. very contested point, especially in Ottoman Turkish or Turkish speaking world, was the ascension from Mecca to heaven. And in texts from the 14th or 15th century, often you find that the ascension took place upon the Burak, the animal which was brought to Mecca by the angel Gabriel. From this point, Vaisi adopts the Arab Sunni Orthodox version of the events. And it's very interesting because it departs from the version of Mustafa Darir, Siyar al-Nabi, which was illustrated some years ago in the palace of Topkapi during the reign of Ahmad III. So you notice in Vaisi's Siyar a mix between history and literature. In the case of Vaisi, it's very clear what literature is and what history is. Of course, it's more difficult to have a very net, a very clear knowledge of what the readers thought about this Sira. It depends on their knowledge of history, and ultimately it's a sociological question. As a consequence, I may add as an hypothesis that these readers may have understood older Siyar, like the Mevlid of Suleiman Çelebi, more and more as literature and not as history or cosmology. And I would add that this hypothesis is sustained by the debates around sacred poetry during the Aufklärung in Germany. And it's also point of comparison between the Europe and the Ottoman Empire in this period, and especially around the possibility of writing an epic about the life of Jesus. And I would only refer to the name of Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock.
Then now you are also again cut.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know why this happened.
Yeah.
So sorry.
That's okay. It happens. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
I'm back on. Okay. So I will conclude with the last reference to Siyar al-Nabi, and maybe I would like to go a step further and try to show how the Siyar al-Nabi can, or the life of the Prophet, can reveal a certain vision of the world. I will take the example of Nabi because it's the first continuation written after the life of the Prophet of Vaisi. Although this continuation was written in two stages at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. And it goes from the Battle of Badr to the conquest of Mecca. I would like to conclude my overview by coming back to the problem central to this symposium, the visions of the world. And I think the Siyar are a very good lookout to give an answer to this question because they are both history and art. The artistic writing of history was supposed to give pleasure. It was an aesthetic performance, but at the same time, it reflects a vision of the world. One clue of this is what we call now anachronisms. I suppose that in this period, the writing of the life of the Prophet had to do with presentification, making present, more as commemoration or mere scientific interests. It's about present. And I'll give one very tiny example of that, but there are more of it. In his Siyar, Nabi describes the place of Badr, of the Battle of Badr, as a beigah, as a market. This description is absent from Sira in Arabic and Siyar in Ottoman Turkish. It's even absent from the Siyar of Veysi, in which the sun, the last chapter is about the Battle of Badr. So where does it come from? In fact, when we read the stories or the accounts of pilgrimage of the 17th century, we find that the pilgrims describe Badr as a Beigah. So Nabi, in his Siyar, applies the description of the pilgrim to the place of Badr during the life of the Prophet. And himself does it in his own account of pilgrimage, a very famous piece of prosa called Tuhfatul Haramain. A second example, and I will go very speed on that, is the possibility of transfer of sacrality between characters allowed by this very blurred conception of times. In the Siyar of Nabi and Veysi, we have a lot of administrative and contemporary terms applied to the Prophet and the relationship.
Renaud, you're completely out now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. If you please sort of wrap up and finish, please.
Yeah, I'm finishing. I was finishing. So I was talking about the possibility of this transfer of sacrality, and I will conclude with this idea that for us, this fusion of past and present, this network of correspondences, this indistinction between past and present appears enchanted. But our conception is itself historical, and as historians have shown, it's not before the 17th century that in Europe, a clear distinction between times replaced the old blurred conception of time. Disenchantment and Zauberung is a word that Weber uses to describe this aspect of our modernity, which gave way to concepts such as nature, supernatural, or bureaucratic societies and powers. We can now understand why Ottoman modernists in the 19th century, at the end of the century, started to reject so strongly writers like Veysi and Nabi. A gap between different visions of the world, still concurrent, was widening and becoming a problem for them. Thank you, and sorry for the technical problems.
Okay, thank you very much. No problem, and you kept up your time. Thank you for your presentation. We already have one question from Guinness Isixel. Yeah, okay.
Renaud, thank you. I will ask the question in English so that it will be useful for everybody. It's not a question, but rather a suggestion. You must have read the book of Claude Atlas, La Maison Mohammedienne, aperçu de la dévotion au prophète en mystique musulman, publié chez Gallimard 2015. Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting book, and it's in line with what you have presented. What she tells is rather at that specific period, at the turn of the 18th century, there is a change in the type of devotion in the Muslim communities, and which shows itself expressly in the Siyar texts. And she offers a very tempting interpretation, rather in the, of course, seeing that she is a Ekberi tendenced scholar in Ibn Arabi scholarship of the period. So I think it might, especially not for Veysi, of course, but reading this, reading the Nabi's text in line with Claude Atlas's ideas would be of interest, I think. That was just my remark.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, of course, there are very important texts written in Arabic at the same time, which are used by Claude Addas. For example, the Sirah of Halabi in Egypt. And it's also about constructing correspondences, analogies between periods, and finding different ways of actualizing the example and the time of the prophet. So yes, I have more focused today on the texts, but yes, of course, there's a whole cosmology sustaining these texts.
Okay, so thank you, Renaud. Maria Mavroudi.
Again, this is not a question, but rather an observation by an outsider. I am a Byzantinist and I have not worked with hagiography. I approach the problem of miracles mostly from the point of view of philosophy. So here is my observation. I think our analysis nowadays of these phenomena like miracles comes out of our own implicitly Cartesian understanding of what's nature, what's reason, etc., etc. And the figures we are studying in the past were in a kind of dynamic of philosophy that's very different than ours. So I think we need to be cognizant of this, of the philosophical difference between what constitutes miracle and what not. And also I wanted to remind that there is a very long discussion. If I remember correctly, Thomas Aquinas discusses what miracle is. And then there are a lot of discussions in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in Europe about miracles. And I think this dynamic that you tried to point out to, I think through art, it wasn't very clear to me what exactly you were trying to do with that. But you were trying to point out some similarities between European and Ottoman developments at that time. They need to be taken into consideration as part of a dynamic, I repeat, of a history of philosophy, and not only of an aesthetic that is literary. Outsider comment.
Yes, of course, that was related to the topic of my communication, but I've done that also. And you're right. I mean, the theme of the miracle of miracles is very important in theology, in Islamic theology, because for Sunni theologians, the miracles are the main proof of revelation. They rely on miracles in order to prove the existence, not the rational possibility, but the existence of revelation. So you have also, that's what I've said, that theology is very important. I mean, all the discussions on miracles are contained in treatises of theology. But in Islam, we have different kinds of miracles. So the treatise of theology start with the miracles of the prophets, and then goes on to the question of sainthood and miracles accomplished at the hands of the saints. So yes, I agree with the contextualization.
Okay, next is Ethan Menchigen.
Thank you. Thank you, Renaud, for your paper. That was very interesting. I wanted to ask a question about something you mentioned. If I understood you correctly, you said that you think that in the 17th century, you can start to see a separation or maybe establishment of literary genres between literature on the one hand, or literary works, and history. And I'm very interested in this question because this issue of genre is very messy, difficult to understand. I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on this. It's something that I do think happens, but I always think about it myself as happening at a later period, maybe towards the later part of the 18th century, rather than the 17th century. But just to hear your thoughts on this, how you see it happening, just a little bit more. I'd be very interested. Thank you.
I would say two things. The first is that the sources of the writing of the Sirah change in 17th century. The sources of Mevlid, of the Mevlid of Suleiman Çelebi, for example, are medieval apocryphal hadiths. So there is a transformation of the sources. And a very clear example of that is the translation of the Mawahib al-Laduniya by the poet and Shaykh al-Islam Baqi at the end of the 16th century, yes. That's the first point. The second is the fact that the distinction between literature and history is in the texts itself. I mean, there is no distinction between history of the Prophet and poetry or sacred poetry of the Prophet. Historical texts elaborate on history, and I think that cultivated or scholars could understand the difference between fact and fiction, and it was an aesthetic pleasure to distinguish between fact and fiction, like when we read a historic novel. I would rather think of historic novel. The distinction comes later, like you seem to think. But I would also say that it's possible that some of the older sources were read in this period as more as literature, as historical texts. And I think about the Mevlid of Suleiman Çelebi, which gives very different and heterodox views for the 18th century. So, I mean, it's not a distinction between two genres. It's more inner distinctions, I think.
Okay, so Gottfried Hagen, are you? Yes, last question from Gottfried Hagen.
Oh, sorry. I saw Harun's hand up, and I was just lowering mine, so I'm not going to ask.
I don't see any. I don't see any hand.
Gottfried, please go ahead.
No, you go. I had a very minor remark, but you go ahead.
I have a question that sort of builds on Maria's question. Have you found any cosmological or theological discussions of these issues in the 17th and 18th centuries?
Yes, the discussions are included in the Mesnevis and in the prosa works. That's why I've said that there is no distinction between two genres. So you have Vaisi speaks about theological problems in artistic prosa. Yes. And you have also treatises and other genres, but that's something quite a bit different from artistic and history, let's say.
Okay. This is Gottfried Hagen. Do you want to add what you wanted to say?
Sure. I'll take advantage of it. I was wondering. I mean, I've always been struck by the way that in Ottoman historiography, proper meaning historiography of states and realms, there is a distinct increasing interest in universal history, starting sort of in the late 16th century And in some and it in some ways sort of builds on older Arabic traditions. There's also an interest in chronology, in calculating, or in basically mapping all those dynastic histories onto a sort of a single chronology. That is also in some interesting ways corresponding to things that are going on in, say, Protestant historiography of the 16th century. But given that, I wonder if you have thoughts about the fact that Vesey, for instance, starts his account of the prophet's life right with his persona, leaving out, for instance, what older Arabic and to some degree also Persian Sirah writing has provided, that is sort of a salvation history from creation up to the prophet. Vesey's prophet always struck me as being distinctly ahistorical, sort of outside of chronological time. But I wonder what that does for your conceptualization here.
Well, it's very rich contribution, so it's hard to answer without much thinking. But I would say that yes, Vesey has struck me because he's at the same time a very good writer and also very orthodox. So I wanted to depart from the idea that artistic writing is not scientific, which is our presumption today. And the second point is that, of course, Vesey doesn't write universal history, but he has other tools or devices in order to universalize the life of the prophet.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this universalization works better if you take him out of the chronology and out of his sort of specific place in history, right?
I have to interrupt you, and I was admiring the background of the picture of Rethymno. Thank you, Godfrey, for bringing this out. So I'm sorry, Tina, but we are going a little bit late, and I will now ask Nicholas Pieces on the floor of this virtual room. Nicholas has studied history at the universities of Athens, Tübingen, and Munich, and he received his PhD from Freie Universität Berlin, from where he still continues his research. I know him more as a specialist in early modern Russian history, and I have to say that he's also collaborating with our institute through another ERC project, Recontrans, that is the history of art and Russian icons in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Nicholas is going to talk to us about Paisios Ligaridis on magic and divination. Nicola.
Thank you very much. I thank the chair for the introduction, as well as the organizing committee for the invitation. I will start with the reference to the categories that set the framework for this research, since it is conducted in the context of a research center on movements of knowledge in pre-modern cultures in Berlin, and a sub-project on the transfers that shaped the intellectual profiles of Greek Orthodox, Phanariot, and ecclesiastical elites in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th and the 18th centuries. Knowledge is in this context defined as invested with a claim to validity, to truth, as movements of knowledge, as transfer, are understood not merely transports of a given knowledge, but the recontextualization, that is, the transfer of knowledge from one context, historical, cultural, epistemic, to another, both movements in space and in time, that go along adaptations and modifications of knowledge, and finally its constitution as such, as knowledge. The basic idea is that precisely such practices that intend to stabilize knowledge, to preserve it, to canonize it, to codify it, or to accommodate it, set knowledge in motion. The person who is the protagonist of this presentation, Paisios Ligaridis, who lived from 1610 to 1678, is in many regards a personification of what has been called the Baroque persona. This is due to both his impressive learning, his vast and bizarre work, his predilection for curiosities and oddities, as well as due to his talent in dissimulation that he demonstrated by switching confessional and political loyalties more than once in his troubled life. He was born and raised in the island of Chios. He studied and later taught at the Jesuit-run Collegio Greco in Rome, before returning to the East as an agent of Propaganda Fide. Then his trajectories brought him from Istanbul to Jerusalem, where he was consecrated Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church, Metropolitan of Gaza, in 1651, then to the Danubian Principalities, where he attached himself to consecutive princes as a preacher, confessor, and a teacher at their courts, and finally to Russia, where he played a crucial role as counselor of Tsar Alexei in the dramatic events that led to the Russian church schism around 1667. In 1655, while in Wallachia, he compiled in vernacular Greek his most important work, the voluminous Book of Prophecies, or more precisely, collection of oracles regarding Constantinople, a compilation of most heterogeneous material from biblical prophecy, Sibylline and Byzantine oracles, to divination, oniromancy, and magic, alongside commentaries and reflections on the knowledge of things to come. Oracle, chrismos, is used both as a genre and as a generic term for any foretelling of the future. The book is divided into two parts. The first is dedicated to already fulfilled prophecies, from the creation to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the second to future ones, up to the restoration of the Eastern Roman Empire and the subsequent end of the world, with the Last Judgment. The work is preserved as a whole in two manuscripts, one in Jerusalem and one in Bucharest, while there exists a partial translation in Arabic commissioned by the Patriarch of Antiochia Macarius and his son, the deacon Paul of Aleppo, who had obtained a copy from the author himself. Ligaridis' opus can be described as an encyclopedic endeavor in collecting and rearranging a vast tradition, while at the same time constructing, indexing, and fixing it as such in a new context. In other words, a case study for a preserving venture that precisely through selection, canonization, and recontextualization modifies knowledge. This venture is informed by various cultural models and references, combining encyclopedic ideals such as Byzantine polymathia, Jesuit antiquarianism, and early modern polyhistory. The image of the industrious bee, Philoponos melis in Greek, collecting the scattered prophecies and the dust-covered oracles, tas δυσπαρμένας προφητείας και τους σκονισμένους χρησμούς, is emblematic for both those epistemic variants and for their overlapping. There are several possibilities and entry points that would facilitate the discussion of the book's contents. On account of our conference's focus on enchantment and disenchantment, I shall concentrate on the prolegomena to the second book, on future prophecies, where Rigarides reflects on the status, the accessibility, and the legitimacy of diverse kinds of prognostication, including magic and divination. The key concept for the justification of his exegetical efforts in revealing divine secrets, as well as for delving into pagan divination practices, appears to be curiosity, periergia, invested with positive connotations and associated to polymathia and polyhistory. The history of this concept, curiosity, the immodest or excessive desire to know, in Christian thought, has often been sketched in a rather simplifying manner. Curiosity, the vitium curiositatis, is thought to have been, from the early Christian times on, a sin, a vice with severe moral implications. A modern positive evaluation of speculative curiosity as a legitimate exercise of human intellect arose only in the context and as a precondition for the scientific revolution, according to Hans Blumenberg, seminal study. However, recent studies on the medieval and early modern uses, notions of curiosity, emphasize its manifold aspects and the differentiated layers it was employed in. The concept of a bona or justa curiositas that served the true knowledge of God was an available and current idea. Rigarides has no difficulty to justify his interpretation of biblical and extra-biblical prophecies by pointing to the nature of Christian truth, which differs in its principal accessibility from the obscure Eleusinian mysteries, as well as to God's philanthropy, who inspired sibyls and prophets for the sake of human consolation. It is a different matter when it comes to divination, where Rigarides lists 12 different sorts of, from oniromancy to necromancy. Here, as mentioned earlier, the justification relates to human curiosity and the accumulation of knowledge. Διαπεριέργειαν και πολυμάθειαν αναφέροντες. However, an ambivalence inherent to this kind of reasoning is hardly concealed. While Rigarides ridicules the common people, ο απλός λαός, and the superstitious little women, τα δυσιδαίμονα γυναικάρια, and he explicitly states that he does not believe in the interpretation of dream books, which he quotes in length, he nevertheless states that not all interpretations of dreams are false, sometimes they come true, and he dedicates to their exegesis, as well as to that of thunders and earthquakes, a lot of space. A particular case in point concerns the so-called cessation of the oracles after Christ's advent, and the question of whether the accurate prophecies of ancient pagan oracles were due to demonic empowerment or simply to fraud. Rigarides more than once contradicts himself. He quotes favorably authors who have supported the one or the opposite option. At the end, he comes out with the original suggestion that Delphi and the other Greek oracles enjoyed truly prophetic charisma, since God had granted this privilege not only to his people, the Jews, but also to the Greeks, in his knowledge that they were destined to believe in Jesus Christ. As far as magic is concerned, Rigarides adopts a common differentiation between legitimate, spiritual, and evil, demonic magical practices, with reference to several authorities, both ancient, such as Favorinus from the Attic Nights of Gellius, patristic, Gregory of Nyssa, Byzantine, most of all, the lexicon of Suda is his favorite source, and early modern 16th century authors such as Aretius and Prodiginus, both Catholic and Protestants. His main argument is based on a differentiation between the views of the ancients and the moderns, οι παλαιοί, οι νεωτερικοί, meaning the scholars of pagan antiquity and those of the Christian age. These are the modern ones, the Christian ones. Magic was initially invested with positive connotations as a true, sublime, and necessary art. Only after the advent of Christ, since the times of Simon Magus, did the connotations of evil magic prevail, the one that requires devil's participation. I shall try to sum up by raising certain issues concerning the interpretation of Ligarides' work. First, the principal question of this conference, whether we deal with the transition from an enchanted towards a disenchanted worldview. The answer tends to be negative. Ambivalence seems to be the overall impression, an ambivalence that is typical not only for the compilatory encyclopedic character of the book, but also for the author's Jesuit training. The refutation and condemnation, even demonization of divinatory and magical practices, along the obvious attraction these branches of knowledge hold for the author, has been noticed for several contemporary Jesuit authors, for example, Martin del Rio, but also for Protestant ones, if one thinks of Johann Alsted and the 7th volume of his encyclopedia, which is dedicated to those branches of knowledge. Besides Ligarides' temporalities, his understanding of ancient and moderns should, if at all, point to a Christian disenchantment of the ancient pagan enchanted world. But this is hardly the book's or the chapter's message. He rather seems to regret such a change. However, there is a marginal comment in the Bucharest manuscript by the hand of Chrysanthos Notaras, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. This means after 1707, when he succeeded his uncle, the Caesar, who, after reading the book, dismisses most of it as futile and deceitful labor, ματιοπονία και ψευδοπονία ως επιτοπλίστων. I believe there is something about it. It does not express simply personal animosities, which were present, or a traditional clerical reservation towards unauthorized prognosticization, but something like an epistemic shift, given Chrysanthos' interest in natural sciences. A second point would be that we deal hardly with a work based on personal experience, on the presence of supernatural element in the everyday life. It is foremost the work of scholar's armchair. It's part of the author's self-fashioning as an erudite churchman. This means it is a work of bookish, of scribal knowledge. And the last question would be whether and in which sense does this person, this work, this intellectual profile belong to the Ottoman world, since we deal with a Jesuit-trained cleric who based himself solely on Greek and Latin sources. A few references to the Talmud and the Quran are mediated through Christian sources. However, I think that such an intellectual profile is part of the Ottoman world of the 17th century in its multiplicity and in its cultural diversity. But this is the matter that I would like to discuss with you if there is time and the interest. Thank you very much. And I am curious about your questions.
Nicola, thank you very much for your presentation. At this point, I'm afraid I have to leave you because I have an engagement at 8 o'clock. So Marinos will take the torch. Marino, you're there?
So, okay, thank you, Jelena, for the introduction, the chairship.
I look forward to listen to you as well tomorrow and on Sunday, some of you. So goodbye and thank you for making me wiser. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Jelena. So we have, I think, okay, we're a bit late, but we have 10 minutes of more discussion. So I see no hand yet. I would just say that how much we need this integration of non-Muslim and also of non-Turkish speaking, Ottoman Turkish speaking scholarship and population in the study of Ottoman culture. So yes, Eleni.
Thank you very much, Nicola. It was fascinating, and Paisios Ligaridis is really a fascinating person. I was just wanted to ask you if you see in from his texts any political, let's say, connotations or a political agenda in the second part of his book concerning future prophecies, especially in regard to Constantinople and the future reconquest by, or restoration actually, of the Christian kingdom that ushers, of course, the end of times. Thank you.
Should I respond? Yes. Yes, I excluded the bulk of the work which refers to historical prophecies. This is the actual focus of the book. And there is indeed a political message which has to do with the so-called Russian expectation, the rise of Muscovy in the middle of the 17th century as the leading Orthodox power. Ligaridis was in the years that followed to link his own biography and his career with this rising power. Indeed, the interpretation of those future prophecies, the prophecies that are to be fulfilled with the restoration of the Eastern Roman Empire just before the end of the world, point to the Russians. The Russians are the blonde people of the Byzantine apocalyptic oracular traditions, and he quotes them in length with suitable, accommodated interpretations that are meant to substantiate this view. It is no coincidence that Paisios Ligaridis was, at this time when he composed this work, a part of the circle of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Paisios Lambardis. He was the one who consecrated him a metropolitan, and therefore he took over this name, Paisios. His birth name was Pantelis, who this patriarch was the head of the pro-Russian fraction of the hierarchy of the Eastern Church, and he was the one who orchestrated a great part of the networks that helped in the process of the legitimization, the imperial legitimization of Alexei Mikhailovich as the successor to the Byzantine emperors. So this is part of a political agenda. At the same time, where this is part of a promotion of oneself, his own career. He dedicates the work to the Tsar before going to Russia. So it is obvious. Thank you for the question.
Yes, and Harun? I think Harun was a second.
Hi, I really enjoyed the paper. I have hi again, Kostas too. I have a question about Notara. And that question is, I mean, you kind of left that open-ended. And I think I kind of want to hear what you think about this question. How many people do you think, and this is, because you have been working on this for so long, how many people do you think, and I'm just looking for a round number from you, may have shared Notara's views on this matter? Do you think he's unique, or would you go so far as to say he's unique? Would you say he's like part of like a group of 5 people? Is it 50 people? Just a round number in your estimate.
Thank you, Harun. It is difficult to come with a number, but I would say that it is not a unique figure, Chrysanthos Notaras. I mean, his reaction towards this kind of knowledge is indicative of at least of a certain current in his own milieu. We know from other clerics, Kostas Saris will talk tomorrow about one of them from the same intellectual environment, who seem to have shared a common view. On the other hand, I would not connect this kind of reaction with a programmatic disenchantment. I mean, this kind of ambivalence, this kind of attraction that those occult branches of knowledge had for the ecclesiastical elite of the Greek Orthodoxy is a phenomenon that continues long into the 18th century. And one could even say that the intellectual and epistemic movement that one can connect with Chrysanthos Notaras or the Mavrokordaty, etc., was one that had no direct continuation into the middle of the 18th century. So it is a question where we can draw continuities to the later modern Greek Enlightenment and so on. So I would say that it is not a unique case, a unique reaction, but at the same time, it does not signify a paradigm change. It's less than that. But if you want a number, I don't know, 20, 30.
Okay, no, that's good. That's great. Thank you.
The correspondence circle of those people. Most of them we do know by name, but for the most of them we just have a few letters, and not more than that.
Okay, Harun, the man of numbers. So, Maki.
Thank you. But thank you for your presentation. My question is actually about a more political work of his. I mean, the political content, not so much about enchantment, disenchantment. So, since it's not quite part of your paper, please feel free to ignore it. He seems to have written something on the condemnation of the, Patriarch in Moscow, and then argued for the absolute authority of the Tsar. So, I'm curious about two things. One, what is the relationship between the political power holder and the patriarch that he imagines? And then if we take that and then apply it to Istanbul, to Constantinople, then are we supposed to expect that the patriarch should also follow the sultans, or does he differentiate? It has to be a Christian ruler. How does he make the argument?
Thank you very much, Paki, for the question. There are two aspects to this answer. The first one has to do with his personal options, and the second one with more systematic and structural ideas. The first is that he was invited to Russia by the Patriarch Nikon himself in order to help him out of this mess with the Tsar. And when he reached Russia, he realized that the wise thing to do was to take the Tsar's side. So there is this kind of opportunism. The second is that his arguments about the primacy of the Tsar, the primacy of the emperor vis-a-vis the church, which were shared by the other Greek and Arab hierarchs who took part at this synod, who condemned Patriarch Nikon, were on the one hand in the same line with the mainstream of Byzantine tradition. I mean, there is also an alternative Byzantine literature which stresses the right of the church, in this kind of constitutional, let's say, subjects. But he and the other participants of the synod can base themselves on this substantial part of Byzantine literature. And the second is that this idea of the primacy of the emperor was in the very interest of the Greek clergy at this time. But for which reason? The reason is that they dreamed, or their idea, their motive was a kind of a condominium over the Orthodox world between the Russian Tsar as the political head and the Greek ecclesiastics as the spiritual one. They wanted, in any case, to downgrade the Russian Church. The important thing was that the Russian Church, the Patriarchate of Moscow and its metropolitans, do not, as the ones who are in the country of the emperor, raise a claim to a primacy in the ecclesiastical sphere. So it was their interest to enhance the Tsar vis-a-vis the church. This does not involve necessarily a consequence for the Ottoman context. The idea is that Nikon, the Patriarch of Moscow, had overdone with his claims not only against the emperor, the Tsar, but also against the Greek patriarchs. So he and his successors had to be reminded of their marginal position in Orthodoxy. And the best way to do it was to call for this invented Byzantine tradition of the primacy of the emperor.
Okay, we're a bit out of time. There is Tuna has raised his hand. So if you can both be very short, so to have at least 10 minutes of a break to make a tea or coffee or a cigarette.
Thank you, Marino. And thank you so much, Nicola, for the wonderful talk. So my question is not strictly about Ligaridis, but just the late 17th century Greek church in general, and particularly their stance, or if they had any commentary or ideas about the Messianic movement of Shabbatai Zvi, which was going on, had actually quite a bit of followers in the very regions where, of course, the Orthodox Patriarchate was most dominant in the Balkans. So I was wondering if there was any kind of official, semi-official church stance or commentary on this Messianic movement. Thank
you. Thank you. What we have is more or less what Georgios Koutsakiotis has collected in his book that was published also in French, the Greek testimony of Shabbatai Zvi's movement. In Ligaridis is too early. I mean, he does not comment in his work on the ongoing movement of Shabbatai Zvi, but some contemporaries of his, as the dragoman of the port, Panagiotis Nikousios, or his successor, Alexandros Mavrokordatos, or the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Dositheos, the uncle of Christians, as I mentioned, do comment with very negative terms about Shabbatai Zvi. In their eyes, the credibility of the Jews, the fact that many of them followed this false Messiah, is further proof that God has abandoned them. This is the main idea. in their comments. Nikousias is the one who seems to have translated one of the manifests of Sabbatai Sevi addressed to his fellow Jews. This is a subject that is in the last years has come up with this publication of this book by Giorgos Koutsakiotis and some studies that followed it.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Asli has also typed the title, a link for this book by Giorgos, which is really remarkable. So, okay, it's almost 10 to 8. So let's have our 10 or at least 15 times minutes break before we begin again. Thank you all and see you in very minute. I don't know, Ethan, you take the floor and it's at your discretion when we can begin.
Sure, I guess we can begin. Looks like a lot of us are back. Okay, why don't we get started then? Where to begin? Well, first of all, I'm Ethan Menchigen. I'll be chairing this panel at Marinos's kind invitation. And in the second panel of the day, we have 3 members all of the project Ghost, Geographies and Histories of the Ottoman Supernatural Tradition. So we have Marinos Sarionis going first, second, Güneş Işıksel, and then last, Aslı Niyazioglu. First, though, I think Marinos Sarionis needs no introduction really here. He's our host, first of all, at the Institute for Mediterranean Studies in Rethymno. He's also the principal investigator of Ghost. He's published widely on topics such as involved with this symposium on the supernatural, but also on Ottoman political thought. And today, he will be speaking to us about sources and traditions of knowledge, revelation, hermeticism, and reasoning in an Ottoman context. So Marinos, I'll turn the floor over to you now. And it's 1:07 p.m. here.
Always getting anxious with this kind of introductions, but anyway, right then. Well, enchantments and disenchantments, one may say, are all about knowledge. So the limits of human knowledge on the one hand, and its sources on the other. The more the world is accessible to the human intellect, the less it is enchanted. The process of its disenchantment, as conceived by Max Weber, is a constant expansion of the limits of the knowledgeable, understandable sphere in expense of the uncontrollable, mysterious, secret one. Criticism to the Weberian theory points out that this expansion is not unilinear or universal. It is followed by or coexists with contraction as a result of the complex interplay of social and cultural actors, and hopefully our conference is going to explore various facets of these processes. On another level, one that connects the disenchantment theory with the notion of enlightenment, the process also concerns the way knowledge of the world reaches the human intellect. There is truth revealed once and for all by prophecy or constantly by inspirations to mystics and saints. There is knowledge to be discovered by reason, experience, and observation. And also there is knowledge discovered once, ancient wisdom to be transmitted or rediscovered by the wise. We have been used to connect the first source, revelation, with enchantment, whereas the second one, reason, is usually linked to disenchantment or enlightenment. As for the third source, commonly called hermeticism in the Western tradition, it stands somewhere in between. Historically, in many ways, it corresponds with the occultist discourse. In Western Europe, it is connected with the esoteric stage of occultism, when theorists and practitioners of occult sciences were trying, and then use Wouter Hanegraaff's words, I quote, to come to terms with a disenchanted world, or alternatively, by people in general to make sense of esotericism from the perspective of a disenchanted secular world, end of quote. This ambiguity, which is expressed in the way occultist views see the world as a set of hierarchies and homologies, puts Hermetic tradition in a transitional stage in the history of disenchantment. Furthermore, if we are to connect disenchantment with enlightenment, we cannot ignore the dimension of the knowledge community, or perhaps knowledge nation, to coin a term based on the political nation, that is the group of people claiming legitimate participation to politics. And one could possibly argue that the expansion of each nation is not unrelated to each other. Revelation may be for all, as in the case of prophecy, but then again it may be mediated by those trained to interpret it, the ulema in the Ottoman case. Or it may be for a few select, as in the case of sainthood or mysticism, but then again everyone can become a saint or mystic regardless of education or social background. Reason and experience may belong to all humanity, but there may be some who know better how to use them, either by training or by vocation. And Hermetic knowledge, ancient wisdom, stands again in a limbo between the two. It usually is rationalistic in its own peculiar way, but it pertains to things hidden, and as such, it's accessible only for the happy few. Thus, the idea in this paper is to seek these intermingling views on the source of human knowledge in Ottoman intellectual history. It would not be fair to ignore the fact that my work is greatly inspired by Marlene Kurz's seminal 2011 book, Ways to Heaven, Gates to Hell, a truly pioneering view into 17th and 18th century intellectual life that really opened new paths for the study of Ottoman theories of knowledge. Kurz describes in detail the way various intellectual currents of the 17th and 18th centuries dealt with reason, akl, showing how wisdom or hikmet replaced philosophy, felsefe, to represent the way of the wise to seek and attain truth. However, as Kurz demonstrates, wisdom had not the same meaning for everyone. What I will actually seek to do in this paper is elaborate her analysis by expanding its time frame and its sample, and try to explore the social political connotations of these intellectual currents. The fact that Sufism-oriented authors tended to promote revelation and vision as the par excellence source of knowledge, or perhaps as a unique or preferred source of the most essential and important knowledge, that of things divine, is of course not surprising at all. Revelation is in the core of religious experience anyway, and especially after Ibn Arabi, mystic knowledge became synonymous with the ecstatic state of mind and with direct communication with the supernatural domain. Not only Ibn Arabi, however, but also the other pole of the late medieval Muslim thought, Al-Ghazali, considered inspiration the first and foremost source of truth. Al-Ghazali makes a distinction between human learning and divine learning. Both contribute to human knowledge, but the second is attained through either revelation or inspiration. Naturally, the preponderance of inspiration became much more pronounced in Sufi rather than ulema authors. A question about inspiration was whether it allowed for the subject to go beyond the Sharia, something rejected by Ibn Taymiyyah, and whether it can be considered a source of knowledge for people other than established saints, something dismissed, for instance, by Kemal Pashazadeh. Sufis such as Ismail Hakim Boursevi, of the early 18th century, were inclined to say that the validity of inspiration was a matter to be determined by a saint himself, and the Naqshbandi scholar such as Shashaqizadeh was rather benevolent toward unconditional acceptance of a saint's inspiration. Although by the late 17th century, Sufi claims to miraculous deeds had become less manifest, their claims to mystic knowledge continue to be a constant feature in Sheikh's biographies. In Boursevi's biography of his Sheikh, the Jelveti At Pazari Sayyid Osman Fazli, mystic knowledge is described as the real miracle worthy of a saintly Sufi. Boursevi states that miracles of knowledge, al-karamat al-ilmiya, are superior to miracles of this cosmic world, al-karamat al-kawniyya, because the former are related to the essence and names of God, whereas there is no good coming for the latter. Thus, by the turn of the 18th century, miracles in Sufi biographies were described as a kind of epiphany, an unveiling, a kashf, or inspiration, ilham, rather than an intervention to the usual course of things. Although attaining the level of sainthood, or at least of illuminated mystic, was not restricted by education or descent, Sufi literature made a very strong distinction between common people with no perception and people of knowledge. For instance, when someone asks the Bayrami Sheikh of the early 16th century, Issam Ejdouddin Akhisari, whether visions, vakia, and dreams, ruya, are all fantasies, khayal. The Sheikh explained that most of what commoners, awam, see are fantasies and made of the colors of the elements, Elvani and Asir. And for the Halveti Niyazi Misri of the late 17th century, divine inspiration is bestowed by God to those who are sincere in their religious practice and avoid worldly ranks and pleasures. On the other hand, reason was God's gift as well, a prerogative of man to know himself, his peers, his environment, the prophets, and ultimately God. It was mainly Al-Ghazali who formulated an orthodox theory of reason, specifying that the term aql could also mean the quality that enables man to study theoretical sciences, as well as the knowledge gained from experience. Kemal Pashazadeh emphasized that it is reflective and deductive knowledge that leads to the knowledge of God's existence, and that, as a rule, inspiration of the saints cannot be considered a weight knowledge. And Mehmet Bergivi, arguably the most influential Ottoman theologian, further stressed the importance of reason to guide the Muslim in the right path. Traditionally, however, and after Al-Ghazali's work seemed to have settled the matter, the use of reason as the sole and sufficient way to knowledge was associated with the philosophers, a term that by the early Ottoman period had already taken a somehow negative overtone. Hikmet, wisdom, was a more positive way to speak of reason, but with different overtones. In Ahmed Tashkiprizadeh's encyclopedia, Miftah al-Sa'ada, we read that there are two ways to acquire knowledge, one by reasoning and one by revelation. And by revelation, the purification of the heart. Sometimes one way leads to another, and there are some who master both. Later on, in his introduction to religious sciences, Tashkiprizadeh repeats that they can be reached either by reason or by purification of the heart. But he also specifies that the way of reason can reach such a degree that brings it very near or even adjacent to the way of the heart. And this degree is attained by intuition and is called intuitive philosophy, Hikmat Zawqiyya, a way shown by Al-Sukhrawani, that is the illuminationist way. At any rate, the belief in the superiority of revelation and intuition over reason continued to be evident even in the work of a devoted rationalist such as Khatib Chelebi, whose illuminationist tendencies have in a large degree been overlooked. He seems to have slightly favored revelatory knowledge, at least in theory, but at the same time being careful to stress that both ways were equally entitled to reach the truth of things. In the introduction to his encyclopedia, Kashf al-Zunun, he explains that knowledge is natural to man. Thought is what distinguishes man from animals. And in his entry on Hikmet, also summarized in his last work, Mizan al-Haq, he stresses that all the speculative and rational sciences are studied by the method of thought and speculation, nazar ve'istidlal. For the sake of avoiding error in thought, men have formulated the law of deduction and speculation and have named it the science of testing and the science of logic. It is the balance and the touchstone of the sciences. Since the beginning of creation, it has been the pivot of the essential, true, and exact sciences amongst all peoples and nations. End of quote. Later on, in Mizan al-Haq, Khatib Chelebi returns to the issue of the different paths to knowledge while discussing an opinion by Ibn Arabi. Like Tashkiprizadeh, he makes a distinction between the method of speculation, based on the deduction, and the method of purification, based on insight and vision. As Malenekus notes, Khatib Chelebi's understanding of Hikmet is closely related to his being open to infidel wisdom. In other words, he did not see Hikmet as a prerogative of Muslims, nor did he consider it a perennial wisdom of sorts. Whereas, as we shall see, Illuminationist philosophy had become the dominant credo for the 17th century Ottoman elite, it seems that an emphasis to the power of reason as an innate gift of man, regardless of religion or nation, continued to exist and flourish throughout the rest of the 17th and the whole 18th century. Educated more or less during the period of Khatib Chelebi's maturity, Evliya Chelebi has no problem to admit that thanks to the power of knowledge, Ilim Kuveti, Christopher Columbus and a certain Padre could foretell to Bayezid II the future of the Ottoman dynasty, whereas they had discovered the New World by the same means. And throughout the 18th century, the rise of reason as a universal source of knowledge that could and perhaps should substitute revelation or insight can be documented in many ways. In understanding human history, scholarly culture, at least outside the decade, turned toward a worldview that emphasized the role of the human actor upon history, as we can see the preponderance of Haldunist theories on historical laws, and the lively theological debates on free will and predestination, for which Ethan knows much better to tell us. In a degree, such views were informed by Naqshbandi circles, including Abdel Ghani al-Nabulusi, Muhammad Shashaqlizadeh, all of the early 18th century, and Ismail Gelembevi in the late part of the century. Scholars and officials associated with 18th century experimentalism and naturalism seem indeed to have been associated with Mujadidi Naqshbandi order. What is perhaps more important, by the early 18th century, it had become a commonly accepted fact that infidels could also be led by reason to find truths heretofore unavailable to Muslims and potentially useful to the Ottoman Empire. Even in the late 17th century, in his defense of smoking, al-Nabulusi argued that Europeans had great knowledge in ancient sciences, such as medicine, astronomy, and engineering, which could and should be used by Muslims. Scholars of the age of tulips and beyond were increasingly translating French or Italian treatises, often with the help of unaround Greek intellectuals. In the early 19th century, another possibly Naqshbandi Sufi and the partisan of Selim III's reform, Birkanizadeh Kishmani, explains that infidels are so capable of inventing new weapons and tools, I quote, because these accursed ones are all oriented towards this world. They always think of increasing their knowledge. End of quote. On the contrary, he goes on, Muslims regard the world as something temporary and transitory, so they tend to neglect worldly affairs and give more importance to religion and piety. I already alluded to the role of illuminationist or Ishraqi philosophy in Ottoman intellectual life. Refined by Shams ad-Din al-Shahazuri in the 13th century, Shihab ad-Din al-Suhrawardi's natural philosophy gave a primordial importance to light, varying intensities of which produce the array of phenomena from immaterial entities down to material bodies. In the same vein, it is light and its perception by varying degrees of human vision that produce knowledge of the world. Through, in al-Shahazuri's formulation, the world of images, a sphere of existence similar to Plato's archetypes, whence mystic visions and miracles originate. For our purposes here, the emphasis on knowledge through a peculiar sort of inspiration and the consequent skepticism against reason is one of the important points that this philosophy brought in Ottoman thought. The other one is what I call the hermetic aspect. Instead of promoting a kind of continuous revelation or inspiration, which could be achieved by anybody following some ascetic rules or exercising love of God, Illuminationism, again in al-Shahazuri's formulation, invented a genealogy of knowledge or rather wisdom, a hikmah, that went back to a primordial revelation before Muhammad, attributing all esoteric and in some degree exoteric knowledge to the ancient sages, usually beginning with Hermes Trismegistus and including the Greek philosophers. Both points, the emphasis on inspiration and the hermetic aspect, favored an elitist gnoseology where knowledge should be kept secret from the eyes of the many. In this, Illuminationism differed drastically from both ulema theology and Sufi theory. As it had already permeated Iranian intellectual life, Illuminationism entered Ottoman thought rather early. One can find its trace in the works of several authors of the late 15th and 16th centuries. It soon became the favorite philosophical tradition of the Ottoman ulema, especially those with broader interests than just theology, from Shirvani and Tashkipulzadeh to Khatib Chelebi and Menchigen Bashi Ahmedzadeh. As for the Sufis, it appears that the illuminationist ideas were especially spread among the Mevlevis, who saw in Mevlana's Mesnevi a representation of Hikmah. Astiran Gilbuzel showed this very well. It appears that the ulema theologians had no problem accepting illuminationist doctrines as a possible, if not the only way to the truth. Their main opponents were Sufi sheikhs who claimed their own mystical union with divine truth and their privileged access to the supernatural, as opposed to the Illuminationist doctrine of an occult tradition going back to ancient wisdom. It is in this light that we may see Ismail Haqqi Boursevi's opposition of the Illuminationist to the Sufi path. Boursevi dismisses the Illuminationists' claim to Hikmet because they begin with abstract thought, Fikri Mujarrad, rather than with God's remembrance, Dhikr. Illuminationist philosophy, with its tendency to attribute knowledge and in fact its own genealogy to ancient wisdom, must have played a crucial role in the spread of Hermetic beliefs in the Ottoman world. That is, not of the corpus Hermeticum itself, but of the idea of Hermes as a keeper and transmitter of ancient knowledge. In this context, it should not surprise us that an emphasis on the precept that knowledge, and all the more so esoteric knowledge, should be kept for the few elect, is evident in authors associated with Illuminationism. A story, for instance, about how Aristotle decided to make wisdom so difficult to grasp that only those fit will comprehend it, in order not to disclose its secrets, runs all the way from Tashkent-Prusa-Des Encyclopedia to Nevi's vernacular counterpart in the end of the 16th century. And the same story can be found in American Akash Zadeh in the early 17th, who adds excessive allusions both to Asukawardi and to Hermes and Idris in Ketib Shelebi and elsewhere. Now, to conclude, I have proposed elsewhere, and Bakit Ezjan independently has also reached a similar conclusion, that the waning of revelation and more generally of the supernatural element in everyday life must have been connected with the Qadis movement, who denied their opponents, the Helveti sheikhs, any possibility of direct access to the supernatural. Miracles had been granted for the last time, or almost, to the prophet, and there was very little probability for a miracle to be seen in the present times. Thus, the Qadis were promoting a less esoteric, more pietistic vision of the world. In a similar vein, the tendency for gnosological elitism can be also seen in the background of an ongoing democratization of knowledge. The Qadis movement, but in a different way their Sufi opponents as well, also included a plea for egalitarianism, where every individual Muslim could and should reason and develop their principles of faith without the mediation of theological and officials. It may be argued that such an egalitarian vision had also a strong absolutist strand, or perhaps rather a unifying tendency. Equality under either a strong ruler or a strict set of confessional rules and principles followed by all. On the other hand, the high bureaucrats and ulemas favorable to Illuminationist elitism, such as Ketib Shelebi, were more inclined to accept a pluralistic society. Recently, Aslihan Birbuzel suggested that the debate on the sacred character of the Persian language was closely connected to the Mevlevi's effort to defend themselves against Qadis accusations by promoting a pluralism expanded to the very core of the latter's arguments, namely tradition. Tradition could then be a dynamic concept that could be expanded to accommodate diverse texts and practices. Significantly, as we saw above, in this struggle, prominent Mevlevi authors connect the Mesnevi to Illuminationist philosophical wisdom, the Hikmah, which could also function as a receptacle for various innovative ideas. What remains still largely unexplored is the way and extent the glorification of reason and the democratization of individual thought, arguably seen from the second half of the 17th century onwards, led to the emergence of materialist trends in some strata of Ottoman urban society. Scholars who denied the existence of heaven and hell, or the resurrection of the dead, or Muhammad's prophetical mission were executed or persecuted anyway in numerous cases, especially in the second half of the 17th century. And the famous description by Paul Ricoeur of an alleged materialist sect among Istanbul scholars seems to be corroborated by a 1715 fatwa about a preacher claiming that a man grows and withers like herbs. Unfortunately, missing further information inhibits our understanding about the philosophical and social connotations of this phenomenon, or even about its extent and magnitude. We can only hope that undiscovered documentation will illuminate this obscure yet important point. Thank you. I hope I did not exceed the 20 limits.
Thank you, Marinos. No, you stayed on time quite well. I think we're just 2 minutes over or so. So it looks like Maria Mavrudi has a question.
Thank you. So it's not really a question, it's just an observation, and perhaps we can discuss this more. Excuse me. It seems to me from your account, which I felt put things in the proper perspective very accurately, all these discussions that you described for the Ottoman context are replaying discussions that have been taking place since antiquity. So this like knowledge versus hikmah, this is already there in the writings of Josephus, like in Jewish authors of late antiquity who are grappling with the pagan world around them. So what is there that can, what is a source of true knowledge? Is it this pagan knowledge that is fashionable in the Hellenistic and Roman period, or is it Jewish revelation, and which should we place above? So this is replayed again in the 9th century in Arabic. It is of course replayed earlier between pagans and Christians in late antiquity and beyond. And it has its own flavor, of course, in the 16th and 17th century, but it seems to me to be reflecting all of this previous tradition. And I think Hermeticism, and it's done not only in Ottoman, but it's also done in the Ottoman realm, but it's also done, let's say, in Europe. I mean, it seems to me that this rise of Hermeticism in the Ottoman realm needs to be correlated with the rise of Hermeticism in Renaissance Italy and beyond. So I want to stop here because there's a lot one can say, and one can pursue this by looking, I believe, always in the manuscript transmission of these works. So I have some ideas, but I stop there.
Yes, well, actually, I was planning to focus much more in Hermeticism and in Hermes, but then I reached this part only yesterday afternoon, so I had to stop short and just prepare 7 pages presentation before. Yes, it is, and actually, also these Ottoman authors, like this discussion about revelation versus knowledge, as was seen in Tashkent, for instance, is actually just a repetition and a replay of Al-Ghazali's, and they are copying even verbatim each other, and then this, I mean, repetition is an inherent vice of Ottoman philosophy. For instance, we see this 1741 short encyclopedia made for the French ambassador, which summarizes Tashkent, but the introduction summarizes Crete XI, and so on and so forth. The correlation of Islamic and Ottoman Hermeticism of the 16th or 17th century with the European one is very tempting. I would refrain at this point of saying something. I mean,
why?
Yes, Crete XI shows some inclination to think in the way of hierarchies of nature and of this very Pico della Mirandola or Ficino style of understanding nature. So even his understanding of magic is natural magic, not demonic one. Well, perhaps there is a difference of okay, they can copy. I mean, arguments and ideas are an inventory which one can use freely. The thing is, I mean, in my view, you have to see why is a particular argument used. Even an argument may have been used for another purpose years or decades or centuries ago, and used for a completely different purpose in another period. And this is very apparent in the history of political thought, for instance. So my ambition is to see, but it's a bit early, why this discussion and where and if is related to it can be put in terms of social history of the 17th and 18th century.
But Khatib Chelebi is talking to other, like to people. I mean, I stop here.
Sorry, we have a lot of questions and we're sort of running short. Sorry for interrupting, but so we have about 5 more minutes, and I think there are 4 questions that have been posed now. So, could I first go to, I think, Gottfried Hagen? You had your question. You had your hand up first, Gottfried.
So, and maybe it helps a little bit, sort of also with as a follow-up to questions Maria was asking. I still try to grapple with this illuminationist aspect of Khatib Chelebi's thinking in particular, because I mean, for all the things I've read by him, I still have to find a point where he is actually invoking that as an authority. So I wonder to what degree all these arguments about the validity or so about inspirational knowledge isn't largely a theoretical product of ideas of systematizing knowledge, but it has barely any sort of practical relevance in actually producing specific items of knowledge, right? And so what am I missing here?
No, I don't think you are missing something, and you know Khatib Chelebi much better than me, and actually perhaps than all of us. Yes, he's talking about illuminationism in theory, mainly perhaps expanding Tashri Puzadeh, but if I remember well, he presents himself as an Ishraki, okay, but then his understanding of Hikmah is completely different. And I'm not a fan of, okay, Kurtz also knows that. His Hikmah is just a universal, innate use of reason to everybody. It's not a revealed wisdom of the ancients. So he's a strange story where, okay, he's self-designed and fervently, I mean, with warm words as an Ishraki, an illuminationist, but in practice, I would not say. I would say that this is at the beginning of a completely different tradition. So I'll stop here. I'll try to be short. I think you're right.
I believe Nir Shafir has the next question. Nir.
Hi, Marinos. Hi, everyone. Thanks for this great talk. Very quick, one question, because I was looking at these sources a few days ago. So I was reading, one was about these Kadezadeli attacks on sainthood, miracles. I find it quite difficult to actually track down what they actually say themselves about this topic. Often you're reading about Kadezadeli beliefs through their enemies. But when I was going through defenses of sainthoods and defenses of miracles in Egypt in the late 17th century, one thing they made clear is that the Kadezadeli groups, or the people attacking them in Egypt, who they directly compared to the people in Istanbul, these people actually believe in miracles. They fully believe in miracles of holy people and saints, but only when they're alive. The controversy was what happens when they're dead, whether or not the dead have any impact on this world. And so I just wanted to see, maybe you discussed this, I couldn't catch everything in your talk, but this seems to be, I don't think that they're in a sort of disenchanting, rationalizing presence, that they just have problems with understanding the role of the dead in the world.
Yes, okay, I would agree, of course, that this is a topic to be much more researched. I have seen rather few sources to be true. So, but the ones I have seen, I mean, okay, there are attacks against Sufis or sheikhs claiming to make miracles themselves in their lifetime. Even beginning from Bergevia, but then they become much more adamant and vehement, perhaps. So they are using terms like istidraj, the gradual temptation by the devil, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me they are very, I mean, at least this few sources, and most of them are from Istanbul, are quite dismissive of claims of their contemporaneous sheikhs to sainthood, to access to supernatural, either in dreams or in breaking the custom of things. But I would be happy to see much more material, and with no doubt this could be give a more nuanced image of this.
Okay, I think I can only manage one more question for this paper, and I don't want to neglect the question and answer, folks. We have a question here from Yasemin Akçıgüner, who says, could you talk about the relationship of the Illuminationists to the Meşaiye Aristotelian peripatetics in Islamic philosophy? How different or similar were they? I'm trying to think of how to situate an 18th century figure like Ibrahim Hakkı Erzurumi, author of the Marifetname, with respect to your discussion.
Yes, this also would be a part of a central part. Yes, I think that the identification of two sections of the ancient philosophers, the peripatetics and the, say, illuminationists, with in terms of Shaki philosophies, I think it began with Giugiani, but was very much pronounced and developed in Ottoman culture. So I think it's a very Ottoman thing that ancient Greek philosophers were claimed to be to represent two contemporaneous trends of thought, this identification. But most of the Illuminationist or not sources, on Ottoman sources on ancient Greek philosophy, actually repeat this motive of two different paths to truth. So they don't really favor one of the peripatetics to the Illuminati, the Meşaiye to the Ishraqiye, and to one another. I don't know if I have answered this, and I would be much more prepared if I had 1 week more. And also, I would also plan to include the Marifetname, but we'll have to do this in the proceedings.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to, in the interest of time, move along. Sorry, sorry, Harun. Maybe next time. But moving on to the second speaker in this panel, we have Güneş Işıksel, who is currently at Medeniyet University, in Istanbul, and he is also one of the charter members of the Ghost Project, if I can use that term. Güneş was originally going to speak about Evliya Çelebi and I think it was Nubia, but he has moved forward his talk into the 18th century, and today we'll instead be talking about 28 Mehmet Çelebi's art of describing, narrative of wonders, and details of precision. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Güneş.
So a week ago, as Ethan mentioned, I changed the object of my presentation so as to save you from my horrible French and to torment you instead with my terrible English. To do so, I will displace you from the Nubia of the 1670s to the France of 1720s, exchanging one Çelebi with another will suffice to do the magic. More particularly, I believe that the new topic will be slightly more in tune with the general problems of the Halcyon Days 11. So after this captatio benevolentiae, let's move. 28 Çelebi Mehmet went on an 11-month mission between October 1720 and September 21 as ambassador to France of Infant Louis XV. He narrated anything that he could catch sight of: roads, castles, palaces, royal gardens, opera houses, hospitals, the observatory, etc. His sefaretname, that is, ambassadorial relation, is always considered as something more than what it simply is. It is read much often as one of the landmarks in the history of Ottoman Europeanization, as if the 1/3 of the empire was not in Europe during the early modernity. For instance, referring to the work, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar accentuated its significance by inserting that, quote, "No other book holds a more important place in our history of Occidentalization than this brief Sefaretname. In fact, the text hides inside a whole program," end quote. I will return back to that, to the question of the program at the end. In this presentation, I will try to read this periagetic text under somewhat a different light. And this I would rather make by focusing on the qualities of its prosa, especially Mehmet's stylistics, uses of arts of description, and techniques of precision. Those who are familiar with the text would remember that he frequently repeats a series of stereotypic expressions such as innumerable, indescribable, words would not suffice, impossible to describe without seeing it, impossible to put into writing, görülmedikçe tabir ve tavsif ile beyan olunmak muhal, kabili tahrir değil, ifade ve beyan mümkün değil, etc. But although his outright negation of the conditions of accurate representation, he does depict what he sees in detailed fashion, and quite admirably so. I will focus on rather two long passages. The first one is often reproduced and commented extract about his experience of Louis XI at the opera, and the second, a much neglected one, which is about his impressions about the Canal de Midi. First one of these will enable me to analyze his style, more specifically his talents in ekphrastic depiction, and the second, his curiosity, precision, and affinity with factual information. Let me make one last word about the version that I will refer to. As you might know, the autograph copies of two drafts of the Sefaretname do not exist anymore. I ventured into a critical edition of the text, for which I collected major copies from the 18th century in order to highlight the evolution of the text. In the meanwhile, Ömer Gezer from Hacettepe University kindly offered me a copy of 28 Mehmet's report, that is Takrir, to the sublime port that he had retrieved in Krieg's archive in Vienna. The letter is extremely important insofar as this report is not extant neither in the Turkish archives nor anywhere else except Vienna. This finding helped me also to confirm that the text inserted by Rashid Efendi to his Tarih was actually this report and not an abbreviated version of the Sefaretname with eventual modifications. I will not detail here the specificities of the three major versions of the text. That is the report, first draft of the Sefaretname and its later versions, published or not. Suffice to say here that the Takrir is the initial version, devoid of later embellishments by 28 Mehmet Çelebi, as well as the censored sections after French intervention. In ancient Greek, ekphazein literally meant demonstrate clearly. According to the Greek and then Latin rhetors, ekphasis is a descriptive speech that brings the things shown vividly before the eyes. Following the specialists of historical narratology, I define ekphasis here as a passage of intensely descriptive writing that expressly calls on the reader's or listener's imagination and places an object directly before the audience in order to trigger a particular series of affects and reflections. Pre-modern authors frequently use ekphrastic descriptions to slow the pace of their narrative, to draw the audience into detailed descriptions of wondrous or exotic objects, and invite the audience to reflect more carefully about the events of the story. This means that an ekphrastic effort often prescribes a set of ideals and values. In the representation of the buildings and monuments that he saw, 28 Mehmet Çelebi deployed the conventions of the rhetoric of classical ekphrasis. These conventions can be listed as pretending not to know how to cover the subject, pleading the forgiveness of the reader, being blinded by the sublimity the object expressed, experiencing difficulty in finding words to mark splendor, eulogizing the artist's skill, and using history and even mythology. In fact, ekphrastic writing is affect writing par excellence. 28 Mehmet, an educated Ottoman, but not particularly a prolific author, is well in tune not only with his precursors of the arts of description and composition, inşa, but also with mid-Ottoman Turkish writers of the mid-17th and mid-18th century, such as Evliya Çelebi, who invented a peculiar ekphrastic and syntactic code. When it came to representing French arts and métiers, however, 28 Mehmet had to invent further strategies to meet the challenge offered by his somewhat complicated task. Let me also note at this stage that narrator of the ambassadorial relations, perception and description of objects are impeded by cultural and personal inhibitions which create a sort of ekphrastic tensions of reception and communication. The background he describes is always uncanny, if not a wonderland. The customs he observes are strange. 28 Çelebi's narrating I or we is therefore situated in a position of extreme alterity. Such exaggeration comes in handy in terms of distancing his narration from the places and people of foreign customs and traditions, thereby shielding Çelebi against criticism of identification with the other. The following passage about his perception of opera appeals vividly to three senses: touch, sight, and hearing. This conscious as well as unconscious strategies he developed to overcome these inhibitions, not to mention his deliberations to avoid religious censure, resulted in a staging of a highly charged drama of affect. One should also point out the very sensuality of his descriptions. Quote, rather a long one, although there was still about an hour of daylight left, but as the building being covered on all its sides, hundreds of candles and countless others, which were placed on crystal candelabras suspended in the air, were lit. The area is exquisitely built, where the balustrades, columns, ceilings, and walls are all gilded. These gildings and the brilliance of the gold fabrics which the ladies wore, as well as that of the precious stones with which they were drowned into, made the most beautiful effect of luxury that cannot be adequately described. When everyone was seated, this curtain was raised, and there appeared a grand palace, in the midst of which were the actors in their clothes prepared for the occasion, as well as about 20 angel-faced actresses with robes and dresses laden with gold, launching thereby new rays of glitter into the assembly. We then heard the instruments play in harmony. After the dance, the opera proper began, which consists in the representation of a story. Each of these stories is printed in a book, which constitutes altogether 30 books. He talks about here about the libretto. They all have their names. In each act is shown a story as if it takes place at that moment. The adventures between them are all played with extreme precision. When the king, for instance, wanted to go for a walk in the garden where the princess was, the palace was in front of us, suddenly disappeared, and in its place, a garden planted with bunch of lime and orange trees appeared. In another scene, he wanted to go and pray in a church. And when they were to have recourse to the magicians so that the princess get rid of the king's pursuits, they deployed several magic tricks. He talks on these tricks. Even more surprising and marvelous things were represented for which I cannot find sufficient expression. Thunder rumbled and heavens sparkled. They have played the emotions about love to such a degree that by seeing the moves, either of the king or of the princess or of the prince, one cannot but feel compassion. End quote. I think he executes himself here a three-act drama that begins with rendering affects through the spontaneous, sensual first impressions about the building. Then he goes on to control and rationalize affect by relating it to a history and contextualize its material background. Once such rationalization, which also serves as familiarization for the readers, once this rationalization is accomplished and religious inhibitions are cleared away somehow, he ends by encouraging the reader to be freely affected by the ekphrastic representation of a representation. The way he manipulates affects to counteract otherness and to meet his society's cultural norms and traditions results in his invention of a new dramatic narrativity. So the first act engages with the visual object through feelings of astonishment and admiration, feelings that rest on the automatic effect of the visual object on its first beholding. Çelebi domesticates the visual object by referring to its geographical and historical foundations and by giving rather factual information about the libretto. The third act is one of reclamation of the ekphrastic object and restoration of narrative features once again. So he makes a sort of play in a play. The object, once more estranged, will be able to return the reader of the first act awe as well as admiration. Now I will pass to the second long excerpt, but before there is a passage from Evliya Çelebi. Now we will meander through the Canal du Midi, but some preliminary remarks are in order. Muvakkit Mustafa''s Tufetüz Zaman, it's written in the mid-16th century. Evliya Çelebi's travelogue account on fisheries, where you see Bartınlı İbrahim Efendi's description of tide in his atlas, or Hasan Eseri's Miyar-ı Duvel contain, as well as Katip Çelebi's Cihan Numa or Ebu Bekr Dimashqi's opus, samples of scientific description of differing success. Some 20 years later, in another ambassadorial report, Ebu Seyyid Numan Efendi will write on trigonometric intricacies of border delimitations with utmost preciseness. Common to them is, I contend, a new syntax. Especially conjunctions are smoothed and temporal tenses are acute as possible so as to render the object observed. In order to illustrate my point, as it is announced at the start, I will read again a long excerpt from 28 Mehmet's impression about the Canal Royal built by Ricky and sponsored by Colbert. Note here that Chandra Mukherjee had written an excellent book on this ouvrage, Impossible Engineering, Technology and Territoriality on the Canal du Midi. So let me quote this long and in fact a bit difficult excerpt from Sefaretname, but just to give you the idea about the canal, which starts up from the Perpignan or Sète to go up to Bordeaux. What they call the canal is one river formed by collecting rivers from the sides and surroundings. Actually, with a suitable vessel for navigation coming from the Mediterranean Sea, access to the ocean, passing through towns and villages without setting foot on land, and many goods are transported. The utility that one finds in this channel are above all that one could hope for. Still, immense construction work had to be done because from the level of the river Agde up to a place called Montagne Noire, the difference between levels is at 120 feet high. Since it was impossible to get the boats up, they have built locks made from ashlars on the artificial river to get the boats up a river that can contain 3 or 4 vessels at a time. These locks have gates on both sides. When a vessel enters, the gate left behind closes and the front gate, whose 2 holes are screwed, stops the water coming from the river. The water is 2 feet higher than the level of the river at the same time when the vessel enters. But when the screws are unscrewed and the water coming from 2 holes fills the pool in less than a quarter of an hour, the vessel is raised to the necessary height. Then the front gate opens, after which the vessels continue on its way as before. These vessels are pulled from the shore by 2 or 3 mules with tight ropes. They have also pierced the mountain that came across with this artificial river. It was only with infinite pains that they were able to build arches from ashlars, which are 200 feet in length, and by means of which one passes over the canal under the mountain. Moreover, when the canal was built, they were obliged to cut and break many sideways to the right and to the left to create paths for cattle, mount animals, and wayfarers. End quote. In this specific passage, the canal is not there as an object of ekphrastic ecstasy, but as one of technical description. Here is what he had described, in effect. Its effect is played down under the guise of its functionality. The passage is a good example of the episodes which are ostensibly there to spellbind the reader by the tremendous but still conceivable efforts of civil engineering. While any allusion to magic, spell, and wonder is absent from the description, there is the narrator's admiration toward the ekphrastic object for the skill of its creator, here, Riquet, and his unnamed equipe. So, something peculiar was going on in Istanbul and some other centers of the empire at the turn of the 18th century. Not only that what had Norbert Elias had called the Zivilisation process in their Official Gesellschaft, but also Ottomans were updating their means of perception by amplifying their field of observation, variegating their methods, patiently noting diverse phenomena, establishing new forms of causality. Much of this will not be unfamiliar to the readers of Science Without Leisure, of course. Let me remind lastly the considerable demand on clocks and watches during the late 17th and 18th century, the regular keeping of Ruznamches, entry of hour, even minutes in the depiction of events. I owe this latter detail to Nurettin Özel. Conclusionary remarks goes especially, or rather not only addressed to Marinos, who had gently asked me about the relevance of 28 Mehmet Seferetname to the Halcyon Days 11, but also to open up a discussion. I shall not detail here the discussions around the so-called Sapir-Whorf thesis. It might have been of help while talking about difficulties while translating the text though. Suffice to say here that according to a long tradition stemming from Kant to Wittgenstein, Cassirer, Sapir, and Whorf, and from there to Bourdieu and Lakatov, language determined the space of possibility of conceptualizations and expressions of affects and thoughts. I contend that by the 1720s, a passive revolution had been achieved after some architectonic changes in the Ottoman syntax and prose style. The indistinctive gerundives do not disappear completely, but they are replaced gradually by conditionals, compound phrases. Tenses started to fix both for future and past perfect, thus leaving a huge space for the present tense to develop. So there seems to be no program, as Tanpınar and many others had contended in the writing of the Seferetname, but the culmination of a concurrent development, many ones at a time. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Ganesh. That was a very, very interesting paper. I don't see any questions right now. Oh, Guy Burak has a question. Please go ahead. I don't think we can hear you.
Guy,
you're muted.
For this thing, it's still. So I'm surprised that, or maybe I'm curious to know what you think about the changes in perspectival, depictions of that you see in, say, for instance, in the depictions of Mecca in the turn of the 17th, 18th century, for instance, the Uppsala map, most famously, but it's a much longer tradition, or even the famous, you think of, say, the depictions of the Sadabad garden that Shirin Hamad studied. And they may seem to be coming out of this similar circles of people who are reading these texts. I'm curious if, and I'm not asking you to, I'm curious to see, I'm curious to know if you see any, or how would you interpret the relationship between changes in visual depictions and the poetic changes that you see in this text?
Thank you, Guy, for the question. I think one has to pass from once, as Panofsky had said, from iconography to iconology in order to interpret all these, because it's both on visual stance as well as on syntaxical stance. There is this change that I can see as well, not only in the depictions of Mecca, but in the late, even in the calligraphy, there are some changes in the plane of the, the mise-en-page of the calligraphical forms. So I think it's a huge question on these changes, but still I just focus on the syntax, which will perhaps enable me to talk about the taxes in the Ottoman Empire more generally. But still, thank you for the remark. I know that I will have to integrate much of artifacts in order to, show this peculiar slow evolution.
Maybe I could actually get a quick question in, Ganesh, if there's no one else with their hand up right now. I'm wondering, do you have any idea how Yemi Seke's Çelebi's Takrir ended up in Vienna in the Kriegszug?
No, it's not the Etan. It's a copy of it.
A copy of it. Okay. I'm intrigued by this.
It's I most probably he had presented the Takvir when he had returned back in the month. It's the October 1721, but I don't know for which reason there was an interest not only in 28 Mehmet but Duri Ahmet's Sefaretname to Safavid Empire as well. So in that dispatch, the Habsburg ambassador had sent both of these. And this was rather at the time when Duri Ahmet had returned back. There are some problems with dating the, I don't know, the copy, but still, since we do not know when 28 Mehmet had presented his takrir to, most probably to Damat Ibrahim Pasha, perhaps it was copied as well by many others, or perhaps I think some scribes had just passed it off to the Habsburg ambassador for one way or another.
Okay, yeah, it's also sort of a good reminder for these Sefaretnames that the versions you find embedded in the chronicles of the Vekai Nuvislar are oftentimes heavily purged or summarized. They're if you can get your hands on sort of,
yes, but I think
copy, they're very different.
This finding, I think, Ethan changed this perspective as well, because when I checked the Rashid's Tarikh and the Takrir, there are very few transformations, and these are on quite minor details. So Rashid had I think inserted everything in the Takrir without touching, only for some small polishments. That's all.
Thank you, Ganesh. It looks like Harun has his hand up. Harun, you have a question?
Yes, I have two small questions actually. Thank you for this presentation. I've actually loved, what you did with the language. And well, my one question is about language. And you would know this because you focus so well on it. Do you think 28 Mehmet wrote these documents, or whether he had like some professional writer of sorts, write it for him? Like he dictates, like he says, say this, and then the guy who's writing just like adds 5 composites to like make it sound right or something like that. I mean, what do you think about that? And I guess the second question is a very small question. So is the Kaltane River like an exercise on making like a mini Canal du Midi?
The second question is, I think there's an article on it, 2 articles on it. Even Sedat Hakkı Eldems talks about it in his Sadabat book on on this idea. It's rather quite out of my actual interests. The effects of the Sefaretname. To the initial question, it's on my mind since I'm working on this text. I don't know, especially for the second excerpt about the Canal du Midi. The problem is it's too accurate. Perhaps he had seen the map. But still he had the official French translator with him from Toulouse. Perhaps they have written this part together, but I don't know. That would be a bit Orientalistic or something like that. So I don't know, keep that point out, in as much as I don't have any data on that part of the journey, and especially the involvement of French translators. I think it was Dufresne. if they have collaborated on some parts of the text, but we would have some part of grasp of it, of this eventual help of the translator from Dubonnac's correspondence with the foreign minister of Louis XV. So that question is always triggers my mind, it intrigues me as well, but I don't know.
Right, no, it's just like, because my impression of 28 Mehmet Çelebi, he's sometimes seen as this kind of like a Moncher type, right? What we call in Turkey, like a Moncher type. To me, he's more of a Turgut Özal type. And that's, he's kind of like, he's engineering minded and he's, practical and things like that, which is, what struck me about his descriptions. Like when it gets to something technical, like he geeks out, right? He's just like, oh, like, it's 5 meters long and 10 meters wide. And like, whereas everything else is kind of like, well, I don't know how to describe this. I mean, when he describes buildings, he almost sounds like a Müteahhit. Here are the columns, and it's just. So I don't know what to make of it, and I don't know how to merge that with literary skill. So I was just curious about what you thought.
Yeah, I think there, if attempt permits, it's just one last remark. The thing which intrigues me with that detail of the attention is that, okay, Evliya Çelebi, with whom I am also very interested in, he's very good at details as well. It was not only about the fisheries in the Tuna River. That was a quite excellent and very detailed description, but for the 28 Mehmet Çelebi, there's a still change of 40 years. I think there might have been, in that lapse of time, some architectonic changes and perception as well, which makes him more interested with the detail, etc. But these are all some, I don't know, suppositions, but difficult to, I don't know, demonstrate anyhow.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's at this point, your impressions are the best we have.
Marinos, did you have any sort of parting words for us? I think that this is the end of things for today.
No, yes, I'm not any kind of chief here. Yeah, I think okay, we should be going sooner or later. What do you expect me to say that? Yes, this was a fascinating session, as the previous one as well, and we would all be glad to continue tomorrow at 6 o'clock, Greek time, whatever time is everywhere. So
okay.
Yes.
In that case, then I guess we're done for this session. See you all tomorrow.
This was the moment that normally we would go to the tavern, fortunately.
All right, take care, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Take care.
Good night.